This is Topics in the Ancient World History. I'm Dr. Young. In the last video, I drew a contrast between the civilization that took shape in the Fertile Crescent, starting around 4000 BCE or so. This farming-based civilization that had these, city-states, and relied on the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Talked a little bit about the physical environment of these places and how important that was, as well as the constant conflict between the city-states. And then drew a contrast with Egypt, right, which was isolated, protected by natural barriers, and which had a stable and unified civilization for a couple thousand years, almost uninterrupted. Even though these are fairly close in proximity to each other, again, we can note that the sort of lower part of the western side of the Fertile Crescent, stretches all the way here, nearly to the Sinai Peninsula, and thus is cut off only by this little strip of land from the Nile Delta. These two civilizations could not be more different, and they did occasionally come into contact and conflict with one another. And that's some of the things that we want to concern ourselves with here today. I want to spend this video briefly discussing some key terms and going through a little bit of chronology here about Mesopotamia and Egypt, so that we can then, in the next video, look at a few sources and use the context that we've laid out here to understand those sources. And so, in general, in the ancient Near East, for Mesopotamia and Egypt, we're talking about the Bronze Age. These are civilizations that flourished during the Bronze Age. Pharaonic Egypt is almost coterminous with the years of the Bronze Age, which runs from, to use nice round numbers here, let's say about 3000 BCE to about 1000 BCE. It's actually a little, we can problematize that chronological stretch a little bit, but that's the period we're discussing here for the most part. Okay, so this 2 millennia long period where these two civilizations were flourishing and innovating and changing. At least in the case of Mesopotamia, they were changing. In Egypt, it wasn't changing very much. The Bronze Age is followed by the Iron Age. The Iron Age is from roughly 1000 BCE until the end of antiquity, which, wherever you want to put that, the 3rd, 4th, 5th century CE. Okay, that's really what we're talking about when we discuss the Iron Age. And some of the subsequent videos here are going to deal with the Iron Age. We're going to look at Bronze Age sources and Iron Age sources and maybe do some comparing and contrasting of these things. So, Bronze Age Egypt, right? Historians have broken this down into some chronological divisions. But suffice it to say, before we look at those, the period roughly 3000 to about 1200, or I guess we can push that all the way to 1000 BCE, Egypt was ruled by a succession of pharaohs. Pharaoh was not only the ruler, the king, but he was also considered a god. The Egyptians had a polytheistic pantheon, like most peoples in the ancient world did, and the pharaoh fit nicely within that pantheon. And the interpretations of who which god pharaoh was, in some cases, he is a kind of living embodiment of one god or another. Okay, that changes over time, but he's, sometimes seen as the living embodiment of the god Horus, for instance, who's one of the famous gods of the Egyptian pantheon. But the pharaohs ruled over Egypt during this period. For most of this period, they were native. That is, they came from the lower Nile Valley itself. There are a couple of exceptions to that, but that's the general rule. The beginning of the pharaonic rule happens around 3000 BCE or so, or there's a pre-dynastic period that runs from that point. We can start to talk about pharaonic dynasties from about the 28th century BCE or so. We can break this into these three major periods. The Old Kingdom from, say, 2800 to about 2200 BCE or so, which sees several dynasties of pharaohs in an almost unbroken succession. The Middle Kingdom, which runs from, say, 2100 BCE to, say, 1700 BCE or so. And then the New Kingdom period, which is maybe 16 or 1500 BCE to about 1100 BCE. Okay. There are these intermediate periods. So the first intermediate period between the Old and Middle Kingdoms is, say, 2200 to 2100. And I mean, we can nuance these years. I'm just giving you very round kind of estimates of these things. The second intermediate period, excuse me, between, say, 17 and 1600 or so, or maybe 1750 to 1600. These are interruptions. Now, there is some debate because there's not a lot of surviving evidence. There's some debate about what caused these interruptions. There may have been a disruption in the Nile flood. There may have been some catastrophes like bad harvests or something like that. The entire Eastern Mediterranean, I will say, and this is notable for some later developments, is very seismically active, and so there's a lot of earthquakes and things like that. Not so much in Egypt, but in other parts of the Mediterranean, but it's conceivable that natural disasters could have led to a kind of snowballing effect that affected a number of societies. We'll discuss that in connection with something else in a few minutes here. But, whatever caused that first intermediate period, there was a disruption. The second intermediate period between the Middle and New Kingdoms was almost certainly, and there's really good evidence for this, caused by an actual invasion of people from the Fertile Crescent. These are known in the Egyptian records as the Hyksos, and they seem to have had superior military technology. Now remember, Egypt did not innovate very much. They didn't need to. They were isolated, protected. Life was good for the most part for almost this entire period. And so they were not prepared when these Semitic kind of Fertile Crescent invaders showed up with war chariots, which seems to have been the key military innovation that allowed them to conquer Egypt for a time. But because Egypt was so stable, the Hyksos were assimilated into Egyptian civilization. They didn't try to change the political system. They ruled as pharaohs. Being a pharaoh is a pretty good gig, right? You're a god on earth and all of that. So anyway, and the Hyksos were later kind of overthrown and a new native dynasty took shape. The one exception to the general rule here, in terms of the way the pharaohs operated, is the New Kingdom. For the Old and Middle Kingdoms, although there were kind of ad hoc efforts to trade or even conquer other areas, for the most part, the political leaders in Egypt didn't try to stage any invasions of surrounding territories. There was no organized, kind of centralized effort to do this. In the New Kingdom, there was, and the New Kingdom is otherwise called sometimes the Egyptian Empire, because the pharaohs did spread out, or rather they organized armies and went and conquered part of the Fertile Crescent, particularly the Levant region, what is now Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, places like that. In addition to spreading south into Nubia, which had a long-standing relationship with Egypt, but they conquered parts of that territory as well, right? And so this is a very different kind of Egypt, which was aggressive and imperialistic, and wanted to make its presence known, probably because there were certain goods that Egypt did not grow natively or have natively, certain resources, and they were looking for those things, and maybe the invasion of the Hyksos convinced them that they needed to be a little more aggressive than they had been previously. Now, there's a lot of information in the textbook about Egypt. I don't want to go into too much detail here. I just want to give you a general overview, right? Let's talk about Mesopotamia for a minute. Mesopotamia, while Egypt was being ruled by pharaohs, Mesopotamia was, for the most part, lacked unity, had these city-states like Babylon and Akkad and Sumer and Ur. We could go back to that map and look at a lot of these things, okay? But city-states were the rule of the day. Now, there were a couple of exceptions to this. I mentioned even in the last video that Sargon, a Sumerian, Sumer is kind of the very southern part down by the Persian Gulf region of Mesopotamia, Sumerian is from a different language family than most of the other languages in Mesopotamia. Most of them are Semitic. Sumerian is from some other language family that doesn't seem to have a lot of surviving relations. But the Sumerians conquered much of the lower part of the eastern Fertile Crescent, and down into the Persian Gulf, and spread up where the two rivers narrow. That's kind of the region that Sargon controlled. This empire lasted only for about a century or so, maybe not even a century. And then it was back to city-states competing with each other. In the 18th century BCE, Hammurabi, who we'll have plenty to say about when we talk about sources, because we're going to read some of the Code of Hammurabi, he conquered most of the Fertile Crescent, or at least all of Mesopotamia. And this is the first of the fairly large empires that would control this area. In the Iron Age, there are going to be some really big empires like the Assyrians and the Persians and others. But we'll get to that later. Okay, so Hammurabi established a rule, and his most lasting legacy, of course, is the law code that he left behind. So we'll look at that next week. So a lot of conflict, a lot of concerns about the environment, right? Again, remember that contrast. This is the important part of the context here. Remember as well how important that law code is, because we're going to look at that and look at the effect that the legal system has on the mindsets of people. One other small empire to mention is the empire of the Hittites. Now, let me look here at the map. I'll come back to those last 2 points in a second here. The Hittites were from what is now Turkey. This is a peninsula called Anatolia, or the Romans later call it Asia, right, or sometimes called Asia Minor. The Hittites were based in the eastern part of Anatolia. They seem to have spread west over to this region, which was inhabited largely by Greek-speaking peoples, and we'll discuss that later. The Hittites may have incorporated the city of Troy into their broader orbit, and that's something else we can discuss a little bit later. But the Hittites arose sometime around the middle of the second millennium BCE, maybe around 1500 BCE or so. And they had some superior technology. The Hittites seem to have been among the first to develop iron technology. And we need to discuss iron and why that's important, but we'll do that when we talk about the Iron Age. So the Hittites, with their advanced military technology, spread out of their homeland, which is kind of this part of Anatolia, down into what is now Syria, right, down into the Fertile Crescent, conquered the upper part of the Euphrates Basin, and then down here where they ran into the New Kingdom Egyptian Empire rulers, and the two fought to a stalemate. Around the middle of the 13th century BCE or so, the Pharaoh of Egypt and the Emperor of the Hittites signed a treaty and acknowledged each other as peers, which was really saying something for the pharaohs, because they, were not ready to acknowledge anyone as an equal. And this seems to have produced a kind of equilibrium there. However, right around or just after that treaty, there was a massive upheaval that happened in the Eastern Mediterranean. Okay, we don't know exactly what happened. This is a mystery to historians. Some have, cobbled together some evidence. There are a couple of decent studies of this that have tried to get at the sources of it. But there was a region-wide upheaval. This seems to have, it was almost certainly caused by natural disasters. Again, earthquakes, volcanoes, possible bad harvests. There have been a few periods where massive volcanoes have erupted, and this leads to kind of global cooling. We're not sure if that's what happened during this time, but this disrupted the entire region, right? And led people to desperation where they took up piracy. And so we have records in Greece about this. We have records in Asia Minor. We have records in the Levant. We have Egyptian records. The Egyptians simply refer to what they call the sea peoples, pirates who came and invaded the Nile Delta. There was a battle. The Pharaoh Ramses III went to battle with the Sea Peoples, managed to defeat them, But the Egyptian Empire lost all of its overseas possessions, meaning all of the stuff that it controlled in the Levant here. The Hittite Empire collapsed as a result of this. There were, some of these sea peoples who seem to have taken up permanent residency in these regions that were previously controlled by the large empires. A group that is notable here is the group that later comes to be called the Philistines. These seem to have been migrants from other places during this period of upheaval who settled in this region, the lower Levant. And this was a watershed moment, really, in the ancient world. This led Greece into a centuries-long, what's called the Greek Dark Age, and really did enact a number of changes. Coming out the other side of this cataclysm is the Iron Age, and that's what we'll discuss in some subsequent videos when we talk about why iron's important and how that changes the dynamics of things. After this, we see very large empires based in Mesopotamia, kind of dominating the whole region. But that's a topic for a later video. If you have questions or comments about the Sea Peoples, I know I haven't given you a lot of information here. Frankly, this is a debatable point. We're not sure, there's not enough information to really say definitively this is what happened. But this is a watershed moment in ancient history where all of the kind of equilibrium that had existed before is destroyed, and something very different emerges from the other side of this. Okay, so we'll look at sources in the next video and start to do our analysis of primary sources, which is really kind of the bread and butter of this course and what we're trying to accomplish. Thanks.